Hello everyone. As I'm sure Hannah Bjork has told you, I have been feeling a bit sick these days. So I decided to record a lecture rather than give it face to face. Well, it would have been digital anyway, but yeah, face to face, as in real time, I was a bit too afraid that I'd have a few bad moments. Just a weird virus, nothing serious, but it's kind of, my breath is kind of, I'm losing my breath and stuff like that. It's kind of weird. Anyway, I don't know if any of you know me. I don't see your names as this is a recording. But I was a postdoctoral student, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Iceland at the Center for Disability Studies. And since September, I am a researcher at the Aarhus University, Marie Skłodowska-Curie researcher, and I will be back in Iceland in 2 years in the Center for Disability Studies. If anything during my lecture you want to hear more about, you want to explore, then please feel free to contact me. I'm giving you my Gmail because it's something that's kind of constant. Tirosh Yoav, that's my name, Tirosh Yoav, at gmail.com. If you have any issues, if you can't reach me for whatever reason, you can ask Hannah Björk. Yes. Is that all about that? Yes. Okay. I'm going to try and not make any breaks, because if I start doing breaks, I will go. Yes. Okay. So, I should say a few, how's this work? I should say a few words about my comics, which is my pride and joy. Viking Comics by Yoav. As you can see here, hilarious comics. They focus on kind of like the struggles of people who write, I guess, and also on Vikings. Viking Comics by Yoav, after all. I'm right now at the middle of writing this kind of series where it's about a story about a sheep shepherd, not a sheep, a shepherd, and yeah, basically chronicling the life of that character. Yeah, and you can see it here. It's not on Twitter. I stopped my Twitter user. Yeah, so you can catch it on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon and Reddit. Bored Panda. Anyway, just look, you have here there's like a name and there's a username. Yeah, please follow and share and have a great time with it. A lot of Icelandic relevant topics. Okay, so I guess one of the reasons that Hannah Björk has brought me is because I guess I offer a certain perspective, very different from the case studies that perhaps you have dealt with until now. I want to explain kind of my approach, which is here I'm in the context of madness. So yeah, basically, until I believe 1973, this is 1974, like an issue from 1974, but until 1973, being homosexual was, gay was considered a mental disorder, and it was even a part of the DSM. This is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychologists and psychiatrists use. And then in 1973, there was a new DSM that was released, and no longer were gay people considered mentally ill. And that's why this hilarious newspaper says 20 million gay people cured. Yes, so you see here, there's two images. By the way, I will describe some of the images, but if someone needs image description, I can, of course, provide something more in detail. Please let me know. But yes, you see an image of a man with, kind of I mean, this is what happens when you Google sexual deviation. You see a man holding what's it called, like the thing, the thing when you're police. Handcuffs, yes, yeah, and then looks very heteronormative situation. Lady looks very excited, I guess. The guy looks very weird. Yeah, so that's sexual deviation. But then another thing that was important is that homosexuality or being gay was entirely taken off the list of the DSM on the same year, and almost a few months nearby, when gay marriage was approved in the United States. And I always found that detail very interesting. Like, you can marry, now you're cured. It's a bit odd. But basically, what the point of this is indeed that, well, madness in this case, right? The mental difference is, in this case, very constructed. And it's sort of like the rules, understanding the rules of a time also help you understand what is considered and what isn't considered a disability. So, we used to think, we're very used to thinking of the conditions that we live in as if there's some permanence to them, or as if people were always in this way. And it's still sometimes hard for me to accept certain things that weren't. I mean, there's some things that seem biological, right? Like, you think of a parent's love, that seems biological. But then if the father doesn't know he's the father, there's kind of like things like that. But yes, there's a lot of constructed things. That's something that's very hard to accept, but I think this is a good example because, of course, I don't think anyone in Iceland surely would define being gay as a mental disorder, but just 50 years ago, the whole world of psychologists would. So I want to give another example that I like very much. This is all still not very connected to the Middle Ages, but I really like it. So I see it's a bit blurry. Hopefully you're looking at it, you can squint, it looks quite clear. This is an episode from the show Mad Men, a great show, big fan. They're bought by a British company, and the British company, so basically Mad Men is about an ad agency. It's about these very successful white men and their women secretaries. Usually there is one specific woman who is an ad woman, but she's kind of like stands out, and yeah, part of the plot. Anyway, at some point there's a British company that buys them as in the company, and they have this event where I guess John Deere is one of the clients that they signed. They're all celebrating because John Deere, as you may or may not know, is a huge tractor company. I'm sure my son would be very excited if he were to sign a contract with them. So, to celebrate, one of the secretaries gets on top of a John Deere thingy and tractor and starts riding it. And the guy, the very happy looking guy, standing to the left of the tractor, gets his leg run over, and he disappears. And then later on, they ask him, I think that they call or they speak to, in this case, they speak to them, and to the British bosses, they ask, so when is he coming back? And they say, the man is missing a foot. How is he going to work? He can't walk. So basically, this person who lost a foot cannot work in a very, very stationary, sedated, office environment. And the characters in this show, the Americans, find it very odd. So they find it very odd that the British people are doing that reaction, though of course there's not really any disabled, like physically disabled characters in the show. I don't think there's anyone with a wheelchair or something like that. So it's kind of hypocritical of them, maybe, but they're very shocked that because the man lost a foot, he can't suddenly be an agent. But the point is, yeah, there is a lot of hypocrisy here, but my main point isn't that, but rather the fact that even at the same time, right, this is the 1960s, and even in the 1960s, you in a TV show, right, but there's a contradiction, there's an incongruous, it doesn't fit. It's not the same the way that it is in the UK and the way it was in the US. And of course, these are very, very similar societies in the sense that they're both speaking the same language. There's a lot of cultural exchanges, and yet they still approach the same society, very similar society, same language. They yet approach disability from a very different perspective. And I think that's something very important to think about when we're talking about Old Norse disability, right? Old Norse, a language. I'll jump to the next slide in this context. So yeah, Old Norse, a very big language, used mostly in Iceland and Norway. So when we talk about Old Norse, we usually talk about Western Old Norse. There's also Eastern Old Norse that was used in Denmark and Sweden. They were quite similar in the 11th century. The more time evolved, the more they got distant. And of course, as you know, Norwegian and Icelandic also split, everything split. But at the time of the sagas, at the time of the sagas when they take place, then they're all speaking sort of the same language. But at the time when they were written, it was already a bit of divergence, but they were still mutually intelligible, especially Icelandic and Norwegian. So still, we have a lot of texts that were mostly written in Iceland, right? The Icelandic sagas the sagas were mostly preserved in Iceland. Of course, there were sagas written in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, but most of them were not preserved because of weather and Reformation and stuff. More weather, I think, than Reformation, at least in the context of this, but yes. So we're talking mostly Icelandic texts. They very often discuss things that happen in Norway or things that happen in Denmark and this kind of things, but they focus on Iceland. So I should be a bit more, a bit more precise. The Icelandic sagas focused on Iceland, but here I wanted to show you like the wide variety of texts when we talk about Old Norse literature. So of course, the sagas, which I'll explore more later, the Christian writings. So these are homilies, hagiographies, biblical translations, and grammatical treatises. So basically texts that explain to you how to use the language. Very, very useful. Scientific writing, geography, science, law, translations. So a lot of translations from French and other continental literature. Sorry. They're referred to as the Riddarasögur. I'm assuming that 99.9% of the participants of this class are Icelandic speaking, but Riddarasögur, the tales of the knights. Yes, so the history of Rome, history of the Jews, I can say that because I'm a Jew. You're supposed to say, I think, Jewish people according to the US standards or something. So just to point out that there's a lot of variants, there's a lot of topics. The sagas are, the Icelandic text, the Old Norse texts cover a very wide range of topics. Another important distinction to make, in case you want to make it, it's that when we talk about poetry, there's two kinds of poetry. Very weird two kinds, because there's the skaldic poetry and the Eddic poetry. The skaldic poetry has a very strict structure to it, very strict rules on how to use it. The Eddic poetry is more loose. And the Eddic poetry, it's more complex than that, but whatever. Not whatever, but not for this context. The Eddic poetry is usually, it's usually the tales of the gods and of heroic men and women of the early Viking Age. So Ragnar Lothbrok, Sigurdur Fáfnisbani, Sigurdur the fighter of the very famous dragon Fáfnir. But then also stories of gods, stories about Thor, stories about Loki, stories about Odin, this kind of stuff. So that's the Eddic poetry. The Skaldic poetry, like I said, very, very strict. But what's interesting is that, even into the 13th century, they used a system called kennings. Kennings are kind of combinations of words or of idioms, like groups of words, where basically you say something like, I don't know, the treasure of Gevion, and then I'm not sure right now if this example makes sense, but basically you say a certain expression that refers to the stories of the gods, and that by saying that you create meaning in the context of the poem. So you might be talking about a king and how he was very rich, and you won't say he's very rich, but rather you'll say that he has a lot of sorry, I was not yeah, it's weird because it's recorded, right? But I can still I could edit this out, this weird relapse of my mind, but no, I'm very authentic. Anyway, yes, you like, I guess one of the better expressions are like the feast of the crows, right? So you would like fallen soldiers, you don't say people died, you say feeding the crows, this kind of things. But a lot of them use Skaldic poetry, and from that we also learn a lot of Skaldic poetry uses a lot of these kind of mythological tales, and from that we can extrapolate a lot about what happened during the stories of the gods. Sorry, that was a weird tangent. Okay, so you all know about Árni Magnússon and how he lived his life and how he just loved letting Latin texts burn. Just important to know that this guy is the guy who thanks to him, we have all the texts, but also he was very selective. He didn't let a lot of Latin texts survive, or rather he less prioritized them, especially during the fire of 1728, when he prioritized his very precious Old Norse texts. And here's just a very quick I'm not going to explain to you what the sagas are. Very quick kind of rundown of the kinds of sagas that you have. Of course, most of you probably have read the Íslendingasögur, the sagas of Icelanders. You might know about the Þættir, these short episodes. Ármann Jakobsson, who I'm sure you all know, has kind of disproven, I believe, the existence of the Þættir as a kind of independent texts. Then you have contemporary sagas, the sagas of Sturlungaöld, the tales of the period of the Sturlungar, bishop sagas, king sagas, legendary sagas, the chivalric sagas that we talked about. All of these categories are all very problematic. I'm actually right now working on a book where I kind of try to complicate that a bit, but these are it's a useful shorthand when we're talking about the sagas. You want to know, wait, is he talking about a saga that took place in the Viking Age, as in, is it the legendary saga, or is he talking about a saga that happened to one of the bishops? But then you have, for instance, sagas that take place. There's a very famous saga, Aun saga, about a guy who gets into a dispute with one of the kings. And it's told in the period of the legendary sagas, but it's very much written like a saga of Icelanders. So there's a lot of kind of like these hybrids, which is a word used very often in Old Norse scholarship. So it's very hard to kind of talk very specifically about these as categorical subgenres, but it's useful. And it's, I stopped using the word subgenres, except here because it's an easy shorthand. I use text corpuses. Here's a short definition that I have written for what the Íslendingasögur are. And you'll see here a small image that I like using. I've used it many times, so I guess there's some digital decay here. So Bændur flugast á, Jón Ólafsson Grunnvíkingur, his definition of the Icelandic sagas. Farmers fought each other. I always find it very, very amusing. It's quite a good summary, I think. No definition I can provide is as succinct as this one. So my definition that I will still provide is the Íslendingasögur, the Icelandic sagas, are a group of prose or prosometric texts that concern the medieval Norse world, usually taking place in the period between the end of the 9th and the mid-11th centuries, and usually focusing on Iceland. Their structural elements usually revolve around feud or feuds, usually with at least one family of farmers. Common themes are interactions with the paranormal, violent competition over women, regional politics, and travel. Yeah. Okay. So, I have too many things around. I was planning to talk about this, but I also already took quite a lot of time just saying that it's very hard to date the sagas. I tried, they said no. Yeah, it's very hard to date the sagas. There's a lot of confused notions about this. If you want later, you can send me an email. I can reference some texts about this for you. Ármann Jakobsson and myself recently published an article where we kind of problematize everything as we do, as he does, and I, kind of follow suit. Yeah, so the sagas are all very late. It's very hard to say if the first extant manuscript of a saga is from the 14th century, can you really say it's from the early 13th century? So you can use maybe language indications, but usually that is not done, but rather what is done more often is circumstantial evidence. And this circumstantial evidence tends to be very problematic. I'm not going to go into that too much now. One important thing is when we talk about the Icelandic sagas, we talk about them being based on oral tradition versus being written. Whole argument about that, but basically the idea is that these sagas were probably composed based on oral stories that were passed down from the Viking Age, and in the 13th century they were written down. To what extent 13th, 14th, 15th century, to what extent there was invention and to what extent there wasn't invention there, that is not for me to say. But yeah, I do have my opinion and I will offer it. There's also the debate about continental European influences the last decades. There's more and more acknowledgement of that. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, there's things I want to say many things, but I'm trying to kind of control myself because I'm trying to keep the time happy. One most important thing, something that Ármann Jakobsson stresses a lot, but something that I also have strong feelings about, is the fact that we are using additions to all of these texts. So you are probably using either the Svarta Kvitu versions or the Íslandsfornrit versions when you read them, the Icelandic sagas. And they're all additions. They're all make editorial choices. They're not the manuscripts. The manuscripts themselves are very often edited, changed. There's all sorts of problems. So yeah, it's best to always remember that if you want to make a certain very particular argument about the Icelandic sagas, always better to kind of make sure that what you're saying is actually based on the text itself, as in what's extant from the manuscript, rather than changes that were made in the editions. Still, you as Icelanders have the great advantage that you are not using translations for the texts, and therefore you have more unmediated access to the sagas. Icelanders find it very easy to read Icelandic Old Norse manuscripts, which is great. I have more difficulty, but I do it when I have to. Just did it a few days ago. Was interesting. It wasn't really an Old Norse manuscript. It was 18th century manuscript, but interesting nonetheless. Okay, I'm not gonna repeat this. Okay, one point that is very important for me to bring across when talking about how to approach the Icelandic sagas for the kind of discussion that we're going to have, right? This kind of discussion of disability in this context is that the sagas are agents of cultural memory. It's quite weird for me to talk about this here because never mind. Sorry. Okay, as you can see, I'm still recovering from being sick. So why is cultural memory important, you might ask? Well, that is because so people use the term cultural memory. They don't always know what they mean when they use it. Cultural memory itself is a term coined by Jan and Leida Assmann, using a thing called collective memory, which I prefer using. I've missed mostly. And cultural memory as a concept is the way that a culture constructs its past. So let's just look at what Jan Assmann says. The concept of cultural memory comprises that body of reusable texts, images, and rituals specific in each epoch, whose cultivation serves to stabilize and convey that society's self-image. Upon such collective knowledge, for the most part, but not exclusively, of the past, each group bases its awareness of unity and particularity. Cool. So basically, we're talking about how a society uses its past in order to renegotiate its contemporary image. So I brought a few examples from Iceland itself. There's playing cards that y'all used in the I forgot when this was from. I think this was issued for the celebration of the Alþingi. Don't catch me on that, but I'm almost sure this is 20th century. Anyway, you'll see you have Hreiðar Heimski, and you have all sorts of characters from Njál Saga and Gudrun Hallgerður. Cool people. But then you have, I kind of charted different representations of Njál Saga. Time is running quite short, so I'm not going to go into it in depth, but you can always pause with the video and you can read more detail if you want. So this is, of course, the Njála Trefil. I think that's how you call it, the Njála tapestry of Njál Saga, that I managed to sew the letter N in there, and I was contributor number 666. Very, very proud of that. 666. Yeah. Can't make those things up. Yeah, this is a very, I'd recommend doing a pause. This is very funny. Grayson Del Ferro, you might notice that there's a quote, "I hate you what you wrote about Njál saga really hurt my feelings. A drunk PhD student. This is actually me. I got very offended by Grayson Del Faro. I went around telling people how much I hate him. But then I realized he's actually quite a nice guy and that what he does makes a lot of sense, kind of summarizing the sagas this way. But it's good that I confronted him and drunk and that it made it into the book. And yeah, I mean, you know, don't never be violent. That is my point. But I mean, I wasn't violent. I was just belligerent. Yeah. Anyway, yes, nowadays, I very much respect what he did in this book. But at the time, I was very, very angry. But it was good. He told me just don't take it too seriously. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. And then I started making my comics. So I guess at the end of the day, it's good to speak your feelings in a respectable way. Don't tell people you hate them. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you can pause and you can read the quotes. This is, of course, the famous Njál play that I'm sure some of you have seen. I do like the representation, like of you know, this Jabba the Hutt, this very very embodied difference of Njál as this kind of monster. Yeah, this choice is very problematic, problematic, but also very, very fascinating because he's supposed to be this kind of big hero, this very white knight, and yet, you know, his body looks like Jabba the Hutt. Yeah, I mean, this is only that scene. Otherwise, he's not dressed like that. Yeah, so this is from the play. And then I wonder if this will work. I'm going to press play. Let's see if this works.
Atgerður, það óska lag fyrir þig. Hann alveg að missa sig í mikjum. Sá merkilegi bóndinn Járnsins skegglausi. Hann makar enn á hóla og makar enn á grunn. Og makar enn í andlitið á strákonum litlastum. Og skeggi vex og vex og vex og Bergþóra það bölvar helst. Keppist við að klippa þá með kartnöglunum alla þrjá. Já, talskegglinga tel ég rétt að kalla þá. Ég er Sigmundur Lambason, þetta er Skjöldur, Hallgerður, ég elska þig. Já, takk fyrir okkur. Takk.
Hallgerður, ég elska þig. It's very silly, but yeah, the main point that I was trying to make here was just that Njál saga seems to be a text that is constantly renegotiated by Icelandic society and reinterpreted. Just recently, Ármann Jakobsson read it in the radio, for example, and you know, this is the second production that Borgarleikhúsið, had. Ever since I've come to Iceland, there were 2 productions of Njál. So, you know, it's a very popular play, as you may or as you know. Yeah. So let's. Oh, okay, yes. I think, okay, I was planning a later break, but I think that this might be a good point to make a first stop. So I will stop and get back to you. I mean, before you can say Jack Robinson. So let me just stop this recording.